It's great to see so many friends, and it's great to be in this moment of launching a new program at ECFR. And of course, we've been talking for almost 20 years as ECFR about concepts, ideas, budgets, strategies, geopolitics, but some of the way I personally arrived to this moment was deeply personal. And of course here, everything I had as a personal experience is 0.1 from Dmytro's. But on 21st of October 2021, I went to meet Dmytro in Kiev. We had our normal standard protocol of the visit. I returned to Chisinau on the 22nd of October. The next day, the US ambassador came to me and told me, I'm authorized to show you this. That was a piece of yellow paper. And he said, we cannot give you a lot of details. And what you will hear in the public domain, you've heard before, but please trust me, it's very, very, very serious about Ukraine. I said, listen, I just came from Kiev. It's like I haven't seen major signs. Of course, everyone is worried, but it didn't feel like we're on the verge of something very serious going on. By December, we started planning for Moldovan security and defense, but also planning for refugees. From late December, we put tents, stoves, heaters in the border crossing areas on the main axis of potential refugee flows. And we've been doing that without really believing there would be a major war. And at the time, I actually met very few people who thought that we are on the verge of the biggest war on European soil since World War II. We checked schools, gyms, hospitals, exhibition centers, whether the windows are good enough to put refugees in such accommodation, whether the electricity wiring is safe enough. And we've done this throughout this period without truly believing there might be a war. Somewhat fast forward, and Dmytro will talk about, of course, his experience. In October 22, the Russians start bombarding the Ukrainian electricity infrastructure. Ukraine has blackouts, we have blackouts. And then very quickly you realize that part of the solution is to have more electricity interconnectors, find fast ways to store green energy in batteries. And we very fast see that actually there is no special procedure to deal with some of the very basic things. If you want to build an interconnector into Ukraine, into Moldova, Ukrainians would do it fast, but on Moldovan, Slovak, Polish, Romanian territory, you go under a peacetime procedure. And of course, thousands of officials will go the extra mile and will work day and night to make this possible. But procedures are procedures, lawyers are lawyers, terms of reference are terms of reference, and public acquisitions procedures and like contesting that in courts is still done on peacetime, which led to a whole family of efforts that gradually has taken the form of several papers that we've all co-participated. And we did a paper with Laurence Boone on wartime economy, where we've been saying that in war, in crisis, you need solutions fast. If it's COVID, you need respirators in 3 days, not in 3 years, and the procedures are not adequate for that. And if you have a war like the war in Ukraine has major repercussions, not just on the military side of things, not just on the front line, and not just in the country at war, but it has repercussions across the globe, you know, on food security, food prices, energy, and we as Europeans don't have solutions for that. Of course, militaries are very good and disciplined, and they have the reflex of doing lessons learned, planning for the next crisis, and thinking about worst-case scenarios. That is completely not the case about the civilian parts of the administrations, and even with the NATO 3.5 plus 1.5 summit, I think the thinking and the strategizing behind the military 3.5 is probably light years ahead of what people think should be done with 1.5. And here, I think it will be very important to get the structures right. And of course, looking back at history, some of the questions we came up with Laurence at the time was, imagine that for the Normandy landing of 1944, you use today's public acquisition procedures, not even for tanks, but for landing boats, for the trucks that brought soldiers to the ports. Imagine that you use today's public acquisition procedures to buy those trucks and landing boats. Which year would have the Normandy landing take place in? Was it like 1950 or maybe 55 or something like that? And this is where we are today. So we definitely need much faster ways to respond to crises. And this is where, as part of this program, and we have an amazing team of colleagues, we will continue digging into making sure we learn the right lessons from the war in Ukraine, from the repercussions of that war on each country in Europe. And we want to structure that work on a more or less good European three-pillar structure. Of course, we'll do a lot of security and defense work, and Camille Grand is with us, and we had a great team working on security and defense. But we also want to make sure we learn the non-military lessons of security. Infrastructure, capacity to export, financing. How do you, mitigate insurance costs for renewable power plants in Ukraine that might be attacked by drones, for example? So there are a whole set of financial, procedural, legal, infrastructural questions that we have already started addressing on top of the military ones. And of course, we will continue working in a very detailed and full spectrum manner on where wider Europe used to work before, meaning, of course, Russia, Ukraine, domestic politics, South Caucasus, Turkey, Western Balkans, the enlargement policy, etc., etc. And with that, it's really a pleasure to do this together with Jana. We've done a lot of things together with Jana at ECFR a decade plus ago. And now with this panel, I'm very happy to announce this program. Thank you very much, Mark. And Dmytro, I'll give the floor to you so that you can share what is your view, your lessons learned. And of course, before I do that, I would invite you also to read Dmytro's paper published about a week ago at ECFR on Ukraine's lessons learned in the military and defense industrial sphere for Europe. Dmytro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nico, Jana. First of all, I'd like to thank Radek and Magdalena for your hospitality. I know exactly the same anecdote with the different ending. When the priest asks the god, "Why didn't you save me?" the god responds, "Sorry, I just don't like you." So, first of all, we should like ourselves, okay? And we should appreciate everything that we have, but we should also be prepared to defend what we have. And I think the biggest lesson that I can share is that you have to believe in the worst, but you have to remain an optimist that you will have enough of power to handle the worst if it comes. And developing this skill of actually believing that the worst can happen, which is a war on the EU soil in this particular case, while remaining an optimist and taking measures to deter this development or to prepare yourself for it, is the skill that everyone in the European Commission and in national governments and in national public will have to gain. If you do not learn how to wait for the worst and remain an optimist, you will go insane. You have to develop this particular skill. Second, be fast. There is no time. We are in a race against time. Be it Russia, be it the United States, be it China, they all pose different challenges to Europe, but they actually all know how to act fast, and Europe has to learn that as well. Everything I've heard coming from smart people in Europe recently could be boiled down to one word: integrate, integrate, integrate. Remove barriers, integrate, become united. That's the only way forward. And actually, from the data that Mark shared with us, we see that the only thing that Europeans are actually optimistic about is about the capability of the EU to become more united. Everyone is talking about coalitions of the willing these days. I remember the old days where it was a taboo to speak about coalitions of the willing because the unity of the EU was sacred. The biggest fear of a European diplomat was to have one country disagreeing with the rest in the EU. And all efforts, if the choice was between having a consensus decision and not having a decision at all, if there was no consensus, the preference would be given to not having a decision at all. So coalitions of the willing is a good thing, and Ukraine, of course, is interested in building them, but it's very important to maintain the sense of unity in the EU, because the proliferation of the coalitions of the willing in the long run will not benefit the European Union as a union. There will be big money in play, and the question will be how to spend this money right. Tons of mistakes will be made, of course. A lot of investors will lose their money, a lot of governments will be challenged, but I think the biggest challenge that needs to be addressed is how to keep the alignment between the spending on defense and the public support for these spendings. Because if you lose, the data gives you good ground. We're not starting from zero. But if people turn their backs to the government spending money on defense, we will see a real revolution in Europe, and we all have to avoid it. Ukraine will keep fighting with your support, and no one can derail us, neither Ukraine nor the rest of the EU, if we stay united. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmytro.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here again. A lot has been said already. I think, when we started discussing with Niku how this program is going to work and what's going to be the intellectual agenda behind it, Niku, you asked me for the first time, I just finished my job in Slovak government, and you're like, Kobzova, you're only coming for the first time back to ECFR? I've done this 3 times already between government and ECFR, so it's that time of the year. Niku and I are both back at ECFR, and very excited to work on this new program. You've heard a lot about what we want to do, and maybe I will just say 2 short things so we can get to other substantial conversations. One is, of course, we'll be continuing to follow the developments in the regions, what's happening on the battlefield, what's happening in different countries, and how the politics in member states influence what we can do and how fast we can do it. But what we hope to do is, and what Niku outlined, is kind of looking at, what is the next crisis? How do we prepare for it? How do we mitigate? How do we prepare in a way that doesn't catch us by surprise? And an example of that work is the brief we just published on Ukraine, which Mark mentioned, which is basically not just looking at, what's the next village the Russians are occupying, or the Ukrainians will liberate, or what's the next outcome of the next Istanbul meeting, even though I think we already know what's the outcome of the next Istanbul meeting. But looking at kind of, what is over the horizon, if we agree that whatever happens in Ukraine is going to have a lasting and profound impact on Ukrainian society, but also on the European security. How do we make sure as Europeans that outcome is good for us? And we're basically looking at the horizon of the next 5, 3, 6 years, looking at the fact that at one point there will be a ceasefire, even though it now looks that it's going to be later rather than sooner. And how do the Europeans and Ukrainians work together to make sure that ceasefire is an opportunity for the country to rebuild, regenerate, and become one of the core pillars of European security? No matter what the political integration of Ukraine with the EU or NATO is, how do we make sure that we cooperate as much as possible? And Ukraine is really, even if it may not control all of its territory, whatever is under Kiev's control is a source of stability, prosperity, and security for all of the EU. Because the other scenario is also very clear, and that is that Russia is going to use the ceasefire to kind of undermine Ukraine from within. The concern a lot of us have is that, once there is a ceasefire in the eyes of European publics, that means the end is war. The end of the war is there, and there is no more need to support, which of course means that Russia will switch its resources to undermining Ukraine in all sorts of other ways. And so that paper is about what the Europeans can do, not just in terms of immediate military help and cooperation that Dmytro talked about, not just in terms of how do we move and open the next enlargement chapter and how do we do it in the face of opposition from a number of member states, but looking at how do we prepare now for that end of hostilities in a way that doesn't catch us by surprise and doesn't destabilize the country even more than it's happening now. So I invite you all to read it. And the second thing I want to say is that, as you can see, we've outlined a broad agenda. We don't have all the answers, but we would very much like to have that conversation with you, with all of you. You know, we'd like to have your input, your cooperation, your collaboration on how to make Europeans and Europe more secure and more ready for whatever is going to come.
Thank you very much, Jana, and profiting from our extreme efficiency, I will use 2 more minutes of the 4 minutes that we have to partly summarize. And basically, as Dmytro and Jana and Radek mentioned, we need to be fast. We have the word speed in the Letta report, Draghi report, Niinistö report, yet we're still not that fast as Europeans. And the parallel to that is firefighters or doctors that need a flashlight to get, you know, they normally drive the same Peugeot or the same Volkswagen that everyone else does, but when they need to get somewhere fast to save lives, they press a button, the flashlight goes, and they make it hopefully in time to save lives. We lack this across our institutional setup throughout most of these institutions of Europe. The European Union, EBRD, EIB, Council of Europe Development Bank, development agencies, they are not geared for being fast in crisis, and we know it. And every time we find an ad hoc mix, but the more crises you have, the less likely the success of ad hoc mixes works. 2, what we are talking about today and the effects of war go very deeply beyond the military. I just read, I think, a few days ago, the Warsaw Museum has kind of set in motion security protocols for the situation of the war. And of course, the historic parallel to that is that the Louvre in France, in Paris, had 3,000 of the most valuable artifacts evacuated from the Louvre a week before World War II started. This is where you have a lot of planning that needs to be done. Each driver basically needs to know which painting where. This is sad, but this is the type of planning that our societies and administrations unfortunately have to do. And of course, the instinct of intellectuals and think tankers and officials, of course, is to think how likely is that? And that is, of course, very important. But it's equally important to be planning for the things that you consider very unlikely, because we've all seen how many unlikely things happened just in the last 3-4 years. Ukraine, but not only. Look at the Middle East. Look at the situation and the state of the transatlantic relationships. Too many unlikely things are happening, and unfortunately we are responsible to be ready for them, not just in the military side of our administrations, and that's the best way to prevent this crisis and to minimize their impact should they happen. Thank you very much, and we'll continue this conversation, and that will take, you know, the form of all the possible ways of having this conversation, and we'll talk today, I'm sure, and tomorrow, and there's papers and articles and podcasts and social media, and we're getting there. Thank you.